Sunday, February 8th, 2026, AGNDD and Tele Report topic. Lawmakers ask what it would take to store International Space Station. Please pardon any visual and informational inaccuracies in this partially AI-generated article-based video. Lawmakers ask what it would take to store the International Space Station. NASA shall evaluate the viability of transferring the ISS to a safe orbital harbor after retirement. Ars Technica. Stephen Clark. February 6, 2026, 10:36 a.m. Members of the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee voted to approve a NASA authorization bill this week, advancing legislation chock full of policy guidelines meant to give lawmakers a voice in the space agency's strategic direction. The committee met to mark up the NASA Reauthorization Act of 2026, adding more than 40 amendments to the bill before a unanimous vote to refer the legislation to the full House of Representatives. Wednesday's committee vote was just one of several steps needed for the bill to become law. It must pass a vote on the House floor, win approval from the Senate, and then go to the White House for President Donald Trump's signature. Ars has reported on one of the amendments, which would authorize NASA to take steps toward a commercial deep space program using privately owned rockets and spacecraft rather than vehicles owned by the government. Another add-on to the authorization bill would require NASA to reassess whether to guide the International Space Station, ISS, toward a destructive atmospheric re-entry after it is decommissioned in 2030. The space agency's current plan is to deorbit the space station in 2031 over the Pacific Ocean, where debris that survives the scorching re-entry will fall into a remote, unpopulated part of the sea. No policy change, yet. The most recent NASA Authorization Act, passed in 2022, extended the U.S. government's support for the ISS program until 2030. The amendment tacked onto this year's bill would not change the timeline for ending operations on the ISS, but it asks NASA to reconsider its decision about what to do with the complex after retirement. The amendment would direct NASA to carry out an engineering analysis to evaluate the technical, operational, and logistical viability of transferring the ISS to a safe orbital harbor and storing the ISS in such harbor after the end of the operational low Earth orbit lifetime of the ISS to preserve the ISS for potential reuse and satisfy the objectives of NASA. Representative George Whitesides, D. Caliphie, submitted the amendment with co-sponsorship from Representative Nick Begich, R. Alaska. The proposal passed the committee through a voice vote with bipartisan support. Whitesides was a NASA chief of staff and longtime executive in the space industry before his election to the House last year. The International Space Station is one of the most complex engineering achievements in human history, Whitesides said. It represents more than 3 decades of international collaboration and investment by U.S. taxpayers, estimated at well over $100 billion. Current plans call for the station to be deorbited at the end of its service life in 2030. This amendment does not seek to change that policy. Instead, it asks a straightforward question. Before we permanently dispose of an asset of this magnitude, should we fully understand whether it's viable to preserve it in orbit for potential use by future generations? In 2024, NASA awarded SpaceX a nearly $1 billion contract to develop a souped-up version of its Dragon spacecraft, which would be equipped with additional thrusters and propellant tanks to provide the impulse required to steer the space station toward a targeted re-entry. The deorbit maneuvers will slow the station's velocity enough for Earth's gravity to pull it back into the atmosphere. Artist's illustration of SpaceX's deorbit vehicle, based on the design of the company's Dragon spacecraft. The modified spacecraft will have 46 Draco thrusters, 30 for the deorbit maneuvers and 16 for attitude control. Credit: SpaceX. The deorbit vehicle needs to slow the station's speed by about 127 miles per hour, 57 meters per second, a tiny fraction of the spacecraft's orbital velocity of more than 17,000 miles per hour, 7.7 kilometers per second. But the station mass is around 450 tons, 400 metric tons, equivalent to 2 freight train locomotives, and measures about the length of a football field. Changing its speed by just 127 miles per hour will consume about 10 tons, 9 metric tons of propellant, according to a NASA analysis released in 2024. The analysis document shows that NASA considered alternatives to discarding the space station through re-entry. One option NASA studied involved moving the station into a higher orbit. At its current altitude, roughly 260 miles, 420 kilometers above the Earth, the ISS would take 1 to 2 years to re-enter the atmosphere due to aerodynamic drag if reboosts weren't performed. NASA does not want the space station to make an uncontrolled re-entry because of the risk of fatalities, injuries, and property damage from debris reaching the ground. Boosting the space station's orbit to somewhere between 400 and 420 miles, 640 to 680 kilometers, would require a little more than twice the propellant, 18.9 to 22.3 metric tons, needed for deorbit maneuvers, according to NASA's analysis. At that altitude, without any additional boosts, NASA says the space station would likely remain in orbit for 100 years before succumbing to atmospheric drag and burning up. Going higher still, the space station could be placed in a 200-mile-high, 2,000-kilometer orbit, stable for more than 10,000 years, with about 146 tons, 133 metric tons of propellant. There are two problems with sending the ISS to higher altitudes. One is that it would require the development of new propulsive and tanker vehicles that do not currently exist, according to NASA. While still currently in development, vehicles such as the SpaceX Starship are being designed to deliver significant amounts of cargo to these orbits, NASA officials wrote in their analysis. However, there are prohibitive engineering challenges with docking such a large vehicle to the space station and being able to use its thrusters while remaining within space station structural margins. Other vehicles would require both new certifications to fly at higher altitudes and multiple flights to deliver propellant. Going higher would also expose the space station to an increased risk of collision with space junk. The hazards from space debris are most severe at about 500 miles, 800 kilometers, according to the engineers who conducted the analysis. This means that the likelihood of an impact leaving station unable to maneuver or react to future threats, or even a significant impact resulting in complete fragmentation, is unacceptably high. This photo of the International Space Station was captured by a crew member on a Soyuz spacecraft. Credit: NASA Roscosmos Whiteside's office did not respond to R's questions, but he said in Wednesday's hearing that his amendment would direct NASA to further examine the costs and risks of putting the ISS in a higher orbit. The legislation simply ensures that Congress receives a rigorous, fact-based analysis so that future decisions involving the ISS are informed by scientific reality, he said. At a time when we're thinking seriously about sustainability in space, this amendment protects taxpayer investments and ensures that we fully understand our options before an irreplaceable asset is permanently retired. Reverend Brian Babin, R. Texas, said he wholeheartedly supports Whiteside's amendment. Reverend Don Beyer, DVA, also endorsed it in brief remarks during Wednesday's markup hearing. I just hate the thought that we would take something not just that we spent all the money on, but such an important part of human history, and dump it in the Pacific Ocean, never to be seen again, rather than preserving it, Beyer said. We don't know whether we can do it in orbit, but if we can, we should really explore that hard. It's not too late. Although NASA's official policy is still to decommission the ISS in 2030, the door hasn't closed on extending the lab's operations into the next decade. There are some concerns about aging hardware, but NASA said in 2024 that engineers have high confidence that the primary structure of the station could support operations beyond 2030. The oldest segments of the station have been in orbit since 1998. undergoing day-night thermal cycles every 45 minutes as they orbit the planet. The structural stability of the Russian section of the outpost is also in question. Russian engineers traced a small but persistent air leak to microscopic structural cracks in one Russian module, but cosmonauts were able to seal the cracks, and air pressure in the area is holding steady, a NASA spokesperson said last month. One of the lab's most critical elements, its power generation system, is in good shape after NASA recently installed upgraded solar arrays outside the station. Another set of upgraded solar panels is scheduled to arrive at the station later this year, just a few years before the complex is to be retired. NASA's strategy is to decommission the ISS and turn to the commercial sector for new, cheaper, smaller space stations to continue conducting research in low Earth orbit. This would allow NASA to buy time on a commercial space station for its astronauts and experiments, while the agency's human spaceflight program focuses on missions to the moon. That's a fine plan, but NASA's program to support commercial space stations, known as Commercial LEO Destinations, CLDs, is going nowhere fast. Supporters of the CLD program say it has been underfunded from the start, and the strategy became more muddled last year when Sean Duffy, then NASA's acting administrator, changed the agency's rules for private space stations. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman is reviewing the changes, and the requirements for stations may shift again. NASA spends more than $3 billion per year for ISS operations, including crew and cargo transportation services to staff and support the outpost. NASA's budget for deep space exploration in fiscal year 2026 is nearly $7.8 billion. NASA is receiving $273 million for the Commercial LEO Destinations program this year, with the money to be divided among multiple companies. Any private space station will need to sustain itself, at least partially, on commercial business to be profitable. Developers have raised concerns that they will be unable to attract sufficient commercial business in areas like pharmaceutical research, tech demos, or space tourism, as long as the government-funded ISS is still operating. One of the companies vying for NASA funding is VAST, which plans to launch its first single-module private outpost to orbit in early 2027. This first station, named Haven 1, will accommodate crews for short-duration temporary stays. VAST plans to follow Haven 1 with a much larger multi-module station capable of supporting a permanent crew. Max Haut, VAST's CEO, does not seem bothered by lawmakers' efforts to revisit the question of deorbiting the International Space Station. The amendment directs NASA to study the feasibility of something other than deorbit and disposal after ISS end of life, which is separate from the issue of retiring the space station and transitioning to commercial partners, Haut said in a statement to Ars. We support President Trump's directive in national space policy to replace the ISS by 2030, with commercial partners who can ensure there is no gap in America's continuous human presence in space. The other top contenders in the commercial space station arena are Starlab, a joint venture between Voyager Space and Airbus, the Blue Origin-led Orbital Reef project, and Axiom Space. Voyager and Blue Origin did not respond to requests for comment from Ars, and an Axiom spokesperson was unable to provide a statement by publication time. Stephen Clark is a space reporter at Ars Technica, covering private space companies and the world's space agencies. Stephen writes about the nexus of technology, science, policy, and business on and off the planet. Comments? Bob Dole 11. Ars Centurion think everyone would love to see the ISS saved for posterity. I would imagine the grandkids of today's generation, when spaceflight may perhaps be common, visiting and touring a monument ISS and learning how primitive it was compared to a plus 50-ish years future, and the bravery of the souls that ventured forth for the expansion of humanity's knowledge, science, exploration, cooperation, and greatness. I've had those feelings and thoughts myself when viewing Apollo-era hardware long ago. standing by a Saturn V dwarfing my 8 years old stature filled me with inspiration to learn about spaceflight, science, and engineering. But the ramifications of a collision, or collisions, with space junk yielding 450 tons of more space junk, yielding further collisions and more and smaller junk, and on is just too great. The debris at a higher orbit takes too long to deorbit. The thought of our orbitals becoming impassable for centuries is terrifying. C9. Seniorius Lurcius Obscriptor. The original goal of ISS was to bring Russia and the US together. How did we do? Sawzall, Ars Tribunus Angusti Clavius. So we're just going to use space as a junk drawer now? Never know when you're going to need that IDE cable from 1992 again. Trout Yosarian Seniorius Lurcius Subscriptor. Park it in orbit as a backup asteroid deflection. Don't even need to keep it operational. Just enough to strap a rocket onto so it can get pushed in the right direction when we need it. That's 450 tons we don't have to get into orbit in a hurry. Ezi Black Ars Scolae Palatinae. All of this made murkier, I assume, if the Russians do, in fact, detach their section to keep it in orbit. Netmage. Ars Tribunus Angusti Clavius. This directive is just government waste as policy. NASA has already evaluated the disposal options and chose the safest one. It is only ignorance that makes this seem reasonable to representatives. FL4. Keash Ars Tribunus Militum. NASA is paying SpaceX $2.9 billion to develop a Starship lunar lander. That work has been ongoing since late 2021 and is scheduled to launch in late 2028. That lunar lander design could be a pattern for a Starship LEO space station, which would have 1,000 cubic meters of pressurized volume. ISS has 913, would support a crew of 10, ISS supports 7, would be deployed to LEO in a single Starship launch. ISS required 12 years, 1999 to 2011, and 35 launches, and would cost $10B. ISS cost $150 billion to build and deploy to LEO and $3 billion to $4 billion per year to operate in today's money. Like the ISS, that Starship LEO space station would use Cargo Dragon and Crew Dragon spacecraft for resupply of consumables and for crew rotation. That Starship LEO space station could be built in 36 months and launched in 2030. Rosine Phi Ars Prefectu. If 20 tons gets us 100 years, does 10 tons get us 50? Would we have better tanker options then? Islane Ars Scolae Palatinae. I'm curious how much longer the existing ISS config can continue to be used safely. Wouldn't any long-term plans require removing and replacing all of the Russian orbital segment, aka the assortment of 70S/80S era, Mir-2 designs that have already leaked? That even Roscosmos axed plans for reusing these modules tells us all we need to know about their remaining useful lifespan. The mothballed scenario also seems nonsensical when parts will continue to degrade and even minor damage could make the station unsafe. Marco Ars Prefectus, Subscriptor ++. Though I'm skeptical that it's wise, the NASA comment that it would require new propulsive technologies is absolute BS. If it requires twice the delta V, it could be accomplished by using a second duplicate Dragon in sequence. No new tech at all. Schlazarg Ars Praetorian Subscriptor ++. Honestly, the most shocking part of this is the fact that our Congress critter, Nick Begich, actually did something in D.C. Been pretty much radio silence from that dude ever since he was elected.
Thank you for watching this AGNDD Until I Report, dear viewers. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell button to get notified during new uploads. And make sure to tune in next time. Stay safe and healthy. Cheers.